She said it had been a long time since she'd found a lightener, although her Gerard kept an eye out. She gave no elaboration as to who her Gerard might have been. Instead, my attention was fixed on a picture attached to the one small area of wall not covered by bookshelves. It was a painting of an eye, very detailed, and at first I would have said almost photorealistic. But the more I looked at it, the more I saw the patterns and symmetries that formed into a single image, until I was so focused on them that I started to have difficulty seeing the eye itself. Written below it were 3 lines in fine green calligraphy. Grant us the sight that we may not know. Grant us the scent that we may not catch. Grant us the sound that we may not call. She asked if I liked the painting, and told me that her Gerard had done it. Said he was a very talented artist. I mumbled something approving, I don't remember exactly what. By the time the knock on the door finally came, I was almost feeling composed enough to answer. Almost. It still took me almost 5 minutes to work up the nerve to open it. The knock did not come again, but I was positive that whatever was on the other side had not gone away. I reached over, grasped the handle, and pulled the door open. Stood just over the threshold was a man in a long, dark leather coat. His hair was dyed an artificial black, and he had the unshaven look of someone who hadn't slept in a couple of days. I asked him if he was Gerry Keay. He said that he was, and told me he'd like to see my book. I nodded silently, and he followed me inside, closing the door behind him. I took out the book and placed it on the table. Gerard studied it for some time, but did not touch it. Finally he nodded and offered to buy it from me for £5,000. I almost laughed when he said that. I would have sold it for a fraction of the amount. I might even have given it away, if it wasn't for the feeling that that wouldn't count, somehow. It's hard to explain. I didn't care what he planned to do with it, I just wanted to get rid of it. And so I agreed. Gerard didn't seem exactly happy at the news. He just nodded gravely and headed towards the door, saying he'd need to get the money and return. I didn't try to stop him. He left, closing the door behind him, and I was alone once again. The whole encounter lasted barely more than a minute. I sat there, waiting in silence for him to return. It was awful, and I needed to find some way to distract myself from the creeping smell, so I decided to get out my computer and see what I could find out about Gerard and Mary Keay. Typing in their names, I don't know what sort of thing it was that I expected to find, but it certainly wasn't a news article from 2008 about Mary Keay's murder. I frantically started searching for any other information I could find. Other news stories covered Gerard's trial for his mother's murder. Apparently he had been acquitted after a significant piece of evidence was deemed inadmissible, although none of the reports seemed to know what exactly that evidence was. It was at this moment the knocking came again. Gerard had returned. I opened the door. I thought briefly about not letting him in, but I knew he'd wait there as long as he needed to, and I couldn't think for the reek of ozone that penetrated every one of my senses. I could not hide the terror on my face as he entered, but if he noticed the change in my demeanor, then he didn't react to it. He simply handed me an envelope filled with cash. I didn't even bother to count it before handing him the book. He looked at the title, then flicked through it very quickly, before laughing just once and nodding, apparently to himself, as though he'd just come to some sort of decision. I had expected Gerard to leave immediately, but instead he walked over to my metal waste paper basket and placed the book inside. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a bottle of lighter fluid and a box of matches. Within a few seconds the book was ablaze and the smell vanished almost immediately. Even as my head began to clear, I felt like I had to ask him why, but he just shook his head. My mother doesn't always know what's best for our family. That was all he said before picking up the waste paper bin, now full of gently smouldering ashes. I warned him it would be too hot to hold, but he shrugged and said he'd had worse. Then Gerry Keay left, and I never saw him or the book again. We've also been unable to locate Gerry Keay at all. Aside from this encounter, he seems to have almost entirely disappeared following the end of his trial. The description Mr. Swain gives does appear to match file photos of Gerry and Mary Keay, and from his description it sounds like he did find his way to what used to be Pinhole Books in Morden, although it has been closed since 2008 for obvious reasons, and no new tenants moved in till 2014. It must have been about 1:30 in the morning that the ambulance arrived. They had radioed ahead, and we knew that we had a pair of severe burn victims being brought in, so we were as ready as we could have been. I was heading out to meet the ambulance when I noticed that the A&E waiting room was totally silent. I looked around, and there were all the people there that I expected to see, some cradling obvious injuries, but none of them made a sound. They continued to stare at their phone, read books, comfort one another, but not one of them spoke. I had just started treatment when the second patient was wheeled in. He was in almost identical shape to the first, except for the fact that the burns seemed to stop at his neck, along a clear line. It was as though he'd been wearing a choker that the heat couldn't get above, but his neck was bare. He was smaller than the first man, and younger, I'd guess in his mid-30s. He was clean-shaven, but had long hair dyed completely black. He wore a similar suit to the older man, except that over the top he wore a long black leather coat, just as undamaged as the rest. It looked new, and I felt quite bad having to cut it off him, but we had to confirm how extensive his injuries were. Like the first, he was completely covered in almost uniform second-degree burns, except for what at first I thought were small black scorch marks. Looking closer, I saw that they were eyes. Small, tattooed eyes on every one of his joints, his knees, his elbows, and even his knuckles, as well as just over his heart. I would have expected the burns to have almost destroyed tattoos that small, but instead they were unblemished, and the skin about a centimetre around each one also didn't seem to have been affected. While the younger man had only a Zippo lighter with an eye design on it, similar to the one tattooed all over him, and an old passport that identified him as Gerry Keay. I never got a look at the passport, but from the way the EMTs were talking about it, I gathered the man was well-travelled. A second before I could touch him, a hand shot out and grabbed me by the wrist. I turned to see the other burn victim, whose passport had identified him as Gerry Keay, on his feet and shaking his head. His grip on my wrist was far stronger than I would ever have expected from someone that injured. I could feel a heat through his bandaged hand, like his skin was still burning somehow. I screamed. Why not? I'd already established no one was around to hear me. He immediately released my hand and apologized, said he'd only been trying to protect me. I asked him from what, and he gestured to the burned man still lying motionless in his bed, chanting his nonsense phrases. Sparing a glance at his own wrapped form, he said that touching the man would have been a bad idea. He seemed to be in tremendous pain as he spoke, but did his best to hide it. I didn't say anything then. I wanted to ask what was happening, and it seemed like he was waiting for me to do just that, but something stopped me. Something told me that if there was a coherent explanation for everything that had happened since the ambulance arrived, then I would be no better off for knowing it. After a few seconds of awkward silence, Gerard spoke. He asked me if the paramedics had brought any items in with them. Specifically, he was after a small book, bound in red leather, and a brass pendant he had been wearing. He didn't say what design had been on the pendant, but I guessed it had been an eye. I told him that neither of those things had been brought in with him, and he was quiet for a long time. After the last 10 minutes spent desperately wishing for another human being to talk to, I should have been relieved with Gerard's company. But watching him, standing and walking despite the burns covering 80% of his body, despite the sheer quantity of painkillers we had given him, he just made me very afraid. Finally he nodded, as though dismissing me, and limped past into the corridor, towards the supply cupboard. I followed him, asked what he was doing. I got no answer, but he seemed to know the code to the door immediately, and strode right in, scanning the shelves for something. He saw what he was after and picked up a small object wrapped in paper and plastic. I recognized it immediately as a sterile scalpel. He was going to kill the chanting man. I could feel it in the way he stared past me as I stood in the doorway. He started walking towards me. The storage room was not big, and it took him barely a second before he was in front of me, but it was the longest second I've ever experienced, as I tried to decide whether to risk my own life for that of the burned stranger, blankly chanting his unsettling prayer. Behind Gerard, I saw bottles of saline solution start to bubble and boil. I stepped aside. He nodded in appreciation, and said something that I remember very clearly, even though it still makes no sense. He said, "Yes, for you, better beholding than the lightless flame." I didn't try to stop him as he walked back into the ward. I just stood there and watched as he took out the scalpel, muttered some words I couldn't make out, and plunged the blade into the center of the chanting man's throat. At that moment there was the sound of sizzling and a smell like rotten meat on a grill. I watched as the flesh around that wound began to blacken and crack. The bandages curled and disintegrated, and the scorched skin spread over his body like water. There was no fire, and I felt no heat. But over the course of 20 seconds, I watched this man's body cremate itself to ash. Even the scalpel was gone. Gerry Keay walked over to his own bed, and picking up the empty bedpan beneath it, gently swept the ashes into the basin and handed it to me, asking me to dispose of it. By the time I was finished and got back to the room, Gerard was lying in his own bed, apparently sleeping. I considered asking him now what had happened, but at that moment another ambulance arrived with 3 members of a Christmas party that had gotten dangerously out of hand. And just like that, the rest of my shift was gone. Gerry Keay was treated for a further 4 days in the hospital before being discharged into the care of his mother. I tried to talk to him about what happened, but he was on a lot of painkillers and never seemed to really register I was there. It may have been feigned, I suppose, but in the end the result was the same. There's obviously a lot to unpack here, so let's start with what is provable. Sasha managed to get access to the hospital records for this period, and they do list the admission of Gerry Keay and an unknown male for burn injuries similar to what Ms. Saraki described. Furthermore, there are only discharge papers for Gerry Keay, and a short police report on the disappearance of the second burn victim. No evidence of foul play was found, and no official missing persons case was ever opened. It was about 2 in the morning when the kid showed up. I think he must have forgotten to lock the door when he headed out, and that's how the kid got in. That said, this was still the first week in March, and it was pretty cold, so I'm surprised we didn't notice the draft. In the end, I suppose it doesn't matter. The fact is that Rachel and I had been sat there chatting for maybe 5 minutes when we noticed we weren't alone. In the doorway, leading back to the stairwell, stood a thin figure. He looked to be in his late teens, I'd guess. He was dressed all in black, with heavy-looking boots and a t-shirt with the logo of some band emblazoned on it, Megadon or Mastodon or something like that. His hair was long and greasy, almost down to his shoulders, and looked to be dyed almost the same black as his clothes. It did not look like he was supposed to be skulking round the Reform Club, but I had encountered more than one member whose rich children were going through a rebellious period, so couldn't be entirely sure. I decided to be gentle in my initial inquiries, and asked him if he was lost. Told him this part of the basement was off-limits due to renovations. The kid shook his head, and asked if we'd found anything yet. Any of Leitner's pages. Now this took me aback a bit, and I wondered how long he'd been standing there, because Rachel and I had just been talking about the man when this teenage burnout turned up. I asked him if he'd been eavesdropping, and he shrugged, and again asked what we had found. I was just about done with this kid, and started to tell him that he was going to have to leave, when Rachel interrupted me and asked what there was to find. The kid laughed, as though he and Rachel were in on some private joke. "Can you smell it?" he said, and for a brief moment I could smell something. Damp old stone and musty paper, just a faint whiff. It took me off guard, and I think that was why I just stood there as he walked past me and picked up the hammer. He strode over to one of the walls and, with a swing far stronger than I would have thought possible from his age and skinny frame, he buried it into the wall. I heard a scream, high-pitched, but it definitely didn't come from any of us. This was enough to break me out of my stupor, and I ran over and wrestled the hammer from the kid. He struggled and flailed, though he didn't say anything. As I tried to calm him down, Rachel called me over, and I looked at where he'd hit the wall. In the center of it was a neat hole. The other side was darkness. There shouldn't have been anything behind the wall except foundation. But it didn't look like this was a real basement wall. I let the kid go and walked over to get a closer look. Rachel started to examine it with her tools before she confirmed what I'd already guessed, that it was a fake. It looked like someone had blocked off a passage and then very carefully disguised it. It was at this point that Alf returned, and we had some considerable explaining to do. Through it all, the kid, who said his name was Gerard, just sat there sullenly, listening to his CD player and waiting. When we asked him how he knew what was behind that wall, he just shrugged and told us that his mother knows all about this stuff. He didn't elaborate as to what this stuff might have been. We should have waited until morning and told the Reform Club staff what we'd found. We should have handed Gerard over to the police, but Alf was always too curious for his own good, and he suggested we have a look inside. Rachel and I half-heartedly tried to argue against it, but I think deep down we wanted to know just as much as he did, so in we went. We tried to tell Gerard to stay outside, but I could see immediately that, short of tying him up, there was no way we were going to keep him out of there. Tying him up did feel like a step too far, so we settled for keeping a close eye on him as we went inside. I couldn't blame him, really. I've never had any sort of claustrophobia, but I was finding it hard at points to catch my breath, to dismiss the feeling that the walls were pressing on me. Gerard walked on ahead, seemingly unbothered by the place. We stood there for some time as I explained this to the others. It took some time to do so, as, with the exception of Gerard, I got the impression that none of us were in any hurry to go down the other tunnels. A deep apprehension seemed to have settled itself in the pit of my stomach, and everyone else also seemed to feel it. Then, without warning, Gerard started running full pelt into one of the passages. I'm not sure which one it was of the 13. I called to him to come back, but got no reply, and Alf took off after him, running into the darkness and quickly turning a corner. I saw lights from up ahead, and was about to call out when Gerard came running back out of the darkness. He was clutching a book in his hands, and clearly wasn't paying attention to where he was going. He barreled right into me, knocking me to the floor again. He was only a skinny kid, but he was so strong, and kept his footing, disappearing back into the darkness towards the entrance. As he passed, I heard a small clattering sound, as though something were falling behind him. I reached out slowly to try and raise myself off the ground, and felt something small and oddly smooth lying there. I shined my light on it, and saw a small bone, from a bird, I think, or maybe a rat. I looked around, and there were a few more scattered about the corridor. There was no sign of Gerard, nor had Rachel seen him. The kid, who I think it is reasonable to assume is none other than Gerry Keay, remains just as impossible to contact as he ever was. I tried to read, but it was so warm that even with the strong coffee in my hand, I found it hard to keep my eyes open and kept nodding off. It was after one such accidental nap that I saw him. He was pale, scrawny almost, and looked utterly out of place. His loose, bright shirt was in stark contrast to his long, black hair. He was staring at me in a way I found quite uncomfortable. I mean, I know I'm not unattractive, and I'm used to creepy guys staring at me sometimes, but this was different. He was staring at me with an air of concentration, like he was trying to read something written very small on my forehead. After about a minute of this, he got up and walked over to me. He took the seat opposite and sat down. He was still staring at me, and it became clear that I was going to have to start the conversation. So I asked him who the hell he was and what the hell he wanted. He ignored the first question completely and said, in English, that what he wanted was to have a nice holiday in peace. He said it in a really accusatory way, like I was ruining his holiday somehow, and I said so. He sighed and said that he wasn't in the business of helping strays. Now, I didn't know what help he was offering, and I certainly didn't ask for it, so I got up to leave. He apologized grudgingly and said that, as he was here, he felt he should at least let me know that I was marked. He didn't know what by, but that it was close. Was I married? Did I have a fiancé, partner, friends? I told him no, not really. I was just about sick of his stupid questions, but he sounded oddly desperate. Siblings? No. Mother? Of course I had a mother. Were we close? Did I love her? I gave him a look, and he again asked if we were close. I said yes, we were very close, and then I got up to leave. As I left, I heard him call after me, telling me to remember my mother, to keep her face in my mind. I didn't reply. It was then, as I felt my grip begin to slide, and I worried that I would lose myself to the crowd forever, that the words of that strange man in the coffee shop came to my mind. Think of your mother. And I did. I'm curious about this coffee shop stranger Ms. Nunes met. His description puts me in mind of Gerry Keay, though there isn't much to it. If it is him, then he must have taken this trip shortly after he was acquitted of his mother's murder. Fleeing the country for a while, perhaps? Maybe there were rumors of a Lightner in Genoa. Maybe he was genuinely on holiday. No way to tell without more detail.
I am always being hunted, both by creatures like the ones you have encountered and by certain human individuals who believe I'm to blame for the books that destroyed their loved ones. 3 years ago, I made the mistake of spending a full night outside my safe houses. I was almost beaten to death by an angry goth.
That'll be our Gerard.
I don't follow.
I wouldn't worry about him. He passed away a couple of years ago. It doesn't matter. Everyone who came close to her seems like it went badly. Her assistants, Gerard, Lightner, Elias, though I don't think Gertrude has anything to do with his going rotten.
She got very good at hiding things from me.
How embarrassing for you. Is there anyone else who might know what it is, or where? Aside from Lightner or Gerard.
Sorry? Gerard Keay?
Yes?
How did you... Who told you he was working with Gertrude?
No one. I read it in one of the statements.
I don't think you did. It's happened.
Look, I don't... Look. Gerard's not really a lead. He's dead, isn't he?
Well, yes, but I believe he and Gertrude travelled together shortly before he passed away. Perhaps if we could retrace their steps, we might find something.
And it was in that state that your associate found me. At the time, I thought he was your son. His French was significantly better than yours, and it took some time and some difficulty translating before I could fully explain to you what had happened. I am telling you my story, since you have asked so nicely, but I will never truly forgive either of you for what you have shown me. I should have been more suspicious of this man, too old for his poorly dyed hair, leading me to an old woman who promised me answers in exchange for an address. I should have walked away. I shouldn't have offered to go with you. But I was in shock from what I had seen, and I believe you could have told me to do almost anything, and I would have been unlikely to argue. Did she perhaps leave her tape recorder at home when she took this little field trip with Gerard? June 2014. Barely a year before her murder, and less than half that before Gerry Keay's brain tumour would lead to his own death. Did he know already that his life was ending? Was he trying to accomplish one last good deed before the end? Were they both? Assuming it was Gertrude Mr. Anderson was talking to. But I feel that's a safe assumption, as the tickets to Wellington were only for one. Perhaps Gerard joined her later. I feel like I've chased dead end to dead end until I finally give up. I mean, what am I actually looking for? Gerry Keay after he faked his death? Some long confession he left tucked away in a library somewhere, telling me the ancient chant I need to stop the unknowing from coming to pass? The address didn't really pan out. The place deals in short-term rentals, and a dozen people must have gone through that apartment since Gertrude and Gerard stayed there. The owner did remember her, that old Brit and her son, but he said anything they left behind was either sold or thrown out. They did leave a forwarding address of sorts. Anything that came was to be sent on to the Usher Foundation in Washington, D.C., who I assume would send it on to the Magnus Institute. I did notice, however, that one of the Greyhound routes there goes through Pittsburgh. Now, according to the details Melanie retrieved a few months back, Pittsburgh is where Gerry Keay allegedly died. He was admitted to UPMC Presbyterian Emergency Department, having suffered a massive seizure, and died less than a day later. I think I might have to pay a visit and ask around. The hospital was interesting. It's all very well being able to get people to answer your questions, but if they genuinely don't remember something, it's not always as useful as it seems. I only found one person, Lewis Browner, a nurse who recalls working the night Gerry Keay was admitted. His mother was with him, and I almost feel like Gertrude took a perverse joy in the pretense. She explained his condition to the doctor, though could apparently offer no good reason he wasn't in full-time treatment, as his cancer was by this point very advanced. They did everything they could to save him, but he had a second seizure shortly after he was admitted, and there was nothing they could do. Unless he was somehow able to lie to me, this nurse, Lewis, honestly believes Gerry Keay is dead. Maybe I came all this way for nothing. There's one thing I very much do need to follow up on, though. Apparently Gertrude was arrested shortly afterwards. Lewis only heard about this second-hand, but she was, apparently, caught breaking into the morgue where Gerard's body was being kept. I need some sleep. Gertrude was arrested for trespassing, but released shortly afterwards without being charged. I managed to track down the arresting officer, one J. Rebbix, who said that she'd been found over the body of Gerry Keay, reading from a large, strangely shaped book. They'd been unable to determine if the mutilations on Gerard's body had been done by her, and in the end she somehow managed to talk them out of pressing charges. Officer Rebbix didn't remember what she'd said, but he did recall that she never returned for the book. It was sitting in evidence for almost a year before, as far as Rebbix was aware, it simply vanished.
You still haven't told me what you're doing this side of the pond, or why you're asking around about Gerry Keay.
Would you believe me if I said I was trying to save the world?
Probably not.
If you're right about that ritual, I guess you talked to Gerard.
You said he was dead?
He is...
Right, so I just read it.
He's the last page.
Good luck, I guess.
You're not staying to, I don't know, keep an eye on me?
It's not a... Trevor doesn't like using the book. I don't either. Makes me feel off. Dead should stay dead.
So, I mean, why keep it around?
Because sometimes talking to the dead can stop you joining them. Come on, Julia.
Just give us a knock when you're done.
Sure. Right. Okay. His consciousness faded in and out like the tide. He tried to refuse their drugs, though for what purpose even he could not have said. Perhaps he was simply trying to push away the smell of disinfectant and grief that rose from his hospital bed. She was there sometimes, the one he had followed around the world. There was almost sadness in her eyes. He felt himself begin to slip, the icy certainty of what was happening seeping through his flesh, and as he fell away for the final time, he felt that all-consuming fear, and his only thought was to cry out for his mother. But with the last vestige of his stubborn will, he refused. She would not claim his last moment. He was silent. And so, Gerry Keay ended. Gerry Keay?
You're new. Did you kill them?
Who?
The hunters. They had this book. Are they dead?
No.
Then piss off. I told them I'm not talking.
Sorry, what?
I'm not that bloody monster manual. I'm done.
I mean, that's not what this is.
No? They didn't hand me over for you to use like I'm a bloody dictionary wrapped in a special box?
Yeah.
Like I said. You got a cigarette?
Oh, yeah, here. Can you smoke it?
I guess not. Yeah. Nice lighter. You a spider freak, then?
What? Oh, no, I never really, thought of it. I'm John, I'm with the Magnus Institute. I'm the archivist.
When did she die?
About a year after you did.
Was it peaceful?
No.
Good. Don't think she would have wanted that. God, I can't imagine her dying in bed. So you're the new guy, then? Following in her footsteps?
I mean, some of them, they don't exactly lead where I thought they would.
Yeah, she was like that.
I'm trying to stop the unknowing.
She didn't manage it, then?
Not before she, I need your help.
Do you now?
She thought she'd found a way to stop it, I think. If anyone knows what that was, it's you.
No.
What? Why not? If it happens, if the circus...
Yeah, the world changes in horrible ways. For you. I'm a book.
You can't be serious.
I'm dead serious. It hurts, being like this. And it's not like any pain you can feel when you're alive. It hurts to exist. To be dead and still here. And those two want to keep me like this so I can answer questions about their Dracula of the week. So no. Help me, or you go to your little apocalypse with nothing.
Fine. What do you want?
I want to go away. I want you to take my page and burn it.
I can't do... They'd know. They'd kill me.
Tear it out and take it, then. Do it somewhere else.
But if they check the book...
Guess you better hope they don't.
Jared, please.
You want answers, you tear up my page now. So I know you can't back out.
Okay.
Okay.
Ready? There.
Thank you.
Well, you've probably killed me.
Dying isn't so bad. It's staying dead that sucks.
Well, these nuggets of wisdom are certainly worth it so far.
Relax, they won't notice.
So?
Okay. You got questions?
Just one. How do I stop the unknowing?
No, I don't know.
What?!
Okay, I don't know exactly But me and Gertrude went all over, tracking clowns and skinwalkers, trying to find a way to mess it up. I didn't find much, but Gertrude, she figured a few things out. She reckoned it could be delayed, but nothing we could do beforehand would actually stop it properly. Even the dancer could be replaced, but once it starts, then it might be vulnerable.
Vulnerable to what?
I don't know.
Oh, God damn it.
But she did say she thought she had something that could do it.
What?
Well, not long before I ended up in the hospital, she told me that if something got her first, There's a storage unit on an industrial estate up near Hainault. She said she rented it under the name Jan Kelly and hid a key for it somewhere in the archives.
I think I found that.
Well, it's in that storage unit. Whatever she thought might disrupt the ritual, stop the unknowing, that's where it'll be.
But you don't know what it is.
No. When I asked her, she said she'd show me when we got back to London. Mind you, she had this weird look in her eyes, like it was some kind of joke.
I mean, it wasn't. What was it? A joke?
I don't think so. Gertrude didn't make jokes.
Well, worst case scenario, I suppose I continue to have nothing.
I guess. So, you're the archivist now.
Whatever that means.
Can't help you much there. Gertrude was always kind of cagey about it.
She never showed any abilities or talked about, I don't know, destiny? Like she was becoming something.
Well, she could make people tell her stuff sometimes. They suddenly get really talkative and lay out whatever she needed. She didn't do it often, though. I don't think she liked it.
Oh, I can do that too.
Right. Do you like it?
I don't know. I never really thought about it. Yes, I suppose I do. Did she read statements?
Sometimes, if she was getting shaky. They perked her up, I think. Feeding the eye, you know. I'd sometimes hear her through the wall, just reading into the air, feeling it all.
She didn't use a tape recorder?
Not when I was with her. She travelled light. Left things behind.
Kind of sounds like you didn't trust her.
Yeah, I didn't. I wanted to. I really did, but it was always the work. Sometimes she just reminded me of my mum. Did you ever meet her, my mum?
Not in person. It was only by reputation.
Well, she was also goal-orientated, ruthless. But at least Gertrude tried to do something worthwhile with it. My mum only had her ambitions. She'd never have even admitted it, though. She was too proud for that. She saw herself as real working class. Always said the occult was just a club for rich boys playing politics with things they didn't understand. Reckoned her tradition was less the academic and more the,
village witch?
You sure you don't know her? Yeah. But deep down what she wanted wasn't all that different from the ivory tower idiots she hated. You know, I think, secretly, she dreamed of starting a little mystic dynasty of her own. With me.
Like the Lucases or the Fairchilds?
Well, Fairchilds is just a name. They're not really family. The Lucases, though, yeah. Thing is, it's harder than it looks. What's out there doesn't care about blood.
Well, I mean, except for the vampire.
Yeah, obviously, except for the vampires. But they care about your choices, your fears, not your parents. Families are just useful because they can push you in the right direction. And the Lucases are very good at that.
And I imagine they're not reluctant to remove any members that might put that legacy at risk.
Right. You know, for a group that worships a power of loneliness, they never seem to have any problems breeding or finding spooky singles to marry them. Just one of those things, I guess. But most times you try to put your descendants on the path to worship, it doesn't go great. Just takes one stubborn heir to freak out about the truth and the whole thing comes crashing down.
And that was you.
Yeah. Turns out not everyone grows up caring about power and knowledge like my mum.
What happened?
I tried to abandon her.
I see. Do you want to make a statement?
Why not? I'll try to make it quick, before the Van Helsings get bored.
Right. Right. Statement of Gerry Keay, deceased, regarding the death of his mother, Mary Keay. Statement taken posthumously from subject June 30th, 2017. Statement begins.
My mum spent her whole life feeling cheated. She used to tell me with a kind of sneer that destiny is for lords, and I think in her own way she actually believed that. You know, she felt we weren't important enough for a destiny, but she never forgot that she came from a noble house, von Closen, all wrapped up in mystery and power. At least that's what my mum believed. I was never able to find much on them, at all. Nothing that would say there was anything special about them, except, maybe their connection to the Magnus Institute and Jonah Magnus. But she'd never accept that. To her, her ancestors were these powerful sages of terrible gods, and their destinies stolen from them by an idle dilettante. At least that's how she told it to me. I remember that Jürgen Leitner was the first man I ever really hated. I'd never met him, but that was the name on the books that my mum spent all her time reading. And half the time when she actually looked at me, it was to teach me about one of them. She idolized him, I think, almost as much as she despised him. She thought he'd managed what she always dreamed of, using these entities without being bound to them. I think she saw him as some kind of sorcerer. So she studied those books that she could find, but she always came back to this one, this unnamed catalogue of the trapped dead. It was her first, she always told me, and would probably be her last. I never knew my dad. Not really. He worked in the archives like you, but quit once I was born. I think he wanted to help raise me. But Mum didn't need the help, and after me she wasn't able to have kids again, so she killed him in his sleep to practice her bookbinding. I guess she failed. I always thought he was in here, but when I eventually got a hold of it, there wasn't a page in there. She did her best to look after me and bring me into this world she inhabited, but she wasn't a caring mother or a skilled teacher. My struggling at her lessons infuriated her. I mean, looking back now, I can see that her knowledge was basic at best. But I was a kid. I could only try to avoid her temper and learn my weird lessons, writing out nonsense and pretending I understood paradoxes that most adults couldn't handle. We travelled a lot. Between her day job as a rare bookseller and her vocation, it wasn't often we stayed in London for more than a month. We met with things that almost made me throw up. I was so afraid. And she talked to them like old friends. It was awful, but I suppose in many ways it worked. Whenever I tried to run away, the real world seemed so ignorant. I could never be a part of it. So I did my best to find my place within my mum's world. As an idiot teenager, I hunted Leitner's books with the best of them. I even found a few. I'd bring them home and watch her eyes light up. But it was always the books that she was happy to see. Eventually, I grew old enough and wise enough to see her obsession for what it really was. Hubris. She lived just carefully enough not to be destroyed by the things she studied, but that was it. The things out there, they weren't like taming fire. They couldn't be contained or used for light or warmth. The best you could hope for from them would be that they don't spot you. And instead my mum chased after them, obsessed with others who had tried to stare at them without being blinded. Flamsteed, Smirk, Leitner. Idiots who destroyed themselves chasing a secret that wasn't worth knowing. And the worst thing was, she marked me as a part of that, without my understanding or consent. Our relationship, such as it was, it quickly went downhill, but I never managed to leave. I just couldn't bring myself to finally cut that cord and abandon her, no matter what she said. And I think she knew that. I think she knew she had me trapped. But it was a hollow victory. She also knew that I wouldn't continue her work, that whatever destiny she had tried to write for the von Closen line died with her. I think that might have been what finally pushed her to do it, to try and take full control of the book. I remember the smell when I came back to the shop that day. The heavy blood smell. She'd just finished writing on the third sheet. She'd hung on that old fishing wire laced between the shelves, and she was on the edge of passing out. She wouldn't stop there. She wouldn't give in. She thrust a razor blade and a marker pen at me and begged me to help her finish. Everything was red. Every possible shade of dark and wet and drying crimson. I turned to run, but I slipped, fell to the floor, and I crawled, panicking, down into the street. I managed to stagger to a coffee shop across the road, and I just sat there in shock until the police arrived. Between the blood on my clothes, eyewitnesses who saw me leaving, and the fact that the mutilations were so awful, the judge said it was inconceivable to suggest they were self-inflicted. It seemed like an open and shut case. And honestly, there was a part of me which thought a life in prison was an alright price for freedom. Trouble was, whatever ritual my mum tried to do, it worked. She had bound herself to the book and was able to manifest almost at will. How she removed it from police custody, I don't know, but it left enough of the other evidence contaminated that my case was judged a mistrial. I was later told there wasn't enough evidence to charge me again. Apparently several witnesses had withdrawn their testimony. I wasn't going to be imprisoned, but I was a long way from free. She was waiting for me when I got home. The half-finished ritual had left her damaged. She was powerful, but erratic. Of course, she blamed me for her new state. Said if I had helped her, she would have been completely beyond death. But as she wasn't going anywhere. For the next 5 years, she haunted my life. I did what she asked, but whenever her form faded for a few days, I would take what little revenge I could. I burned books, I covered leads, occasionally fled somewhere I thought it would be hard for her to follow. And in the end, it was Gertrude who saved me. She came to me when I was desperate, nowhere to go. And she offered to help. I just had to make sure I took the book while my mum was fading and brought it to her, and then she would free me. I didn't really believe her, I don't think, but I did it anyway. When she returned the book to me a week later, her pages burned and mangled, I think I actually cried with relief. I never even considered that my mum might have taught Gertrude how to make pages for it before she was destroyed. I think you know the rest. I joined Gertrude's work for a few years. Didn't realise how ill I was until it finally caught up with me. Then I died. I think I finally understand why she brought me back. I just don't understand why she left me behind.
What was Gertrude's work?
Huh.
I'm sorry, I know a lot about what Gertrude did, but I don't really know why she was doing any of it, or what her intentions were.
Same as you, I think.
Stopping the unknowing.
Not just the unknowing. All of them.
There are more rituals.
That's what she said.
What do they do?
I mean, they change the world. They make it new.
An apocalypse.
Kind of. How much do you know about these things? You know, the eye and that.
I don't, they're malicious. Many consider them godlike, and they have the power to affect the world in unnatural ways, but they cannot directly exist within it, so they rely on avatars or servants that they corrupt, and sometimes monsters that they create. They use their power in ways small enough to stay hidden, and I think they feed on our fear.
No, they don't feed on it. They are it.
What? What do you mean?
I mean what I said. These things, these forces, they are our fear. deep fears, primordial, always looking for ways to grow and spread.
But that doesn't... I mean, it doesn't make...
Okay, so you thought it was just coincidence that unknowable alien consciousnesses from beyond our universe just so happened to basically be all the things we're terrified of?
How?
No idea. Smarter people than me have died trying to figure that one out. I mean, maybe they appeared out of nothing the first time something felt afraid. Maybe they're older than that, and they just got inspired by all the things that we dread. Did they make themselves from our fears, or are they why we're afraid? I really don't know.
But not everything they do inspires fear.
And if you're having an omelette for lunch, not every moment is spent eating the omelette. Some things take preparation, especially if, you know, your spatula has a bit of free will. And sometimes I think bits of them just ooze into the world without any purpose at all. Or sometimes they're summoned.
Fears change. Fears are cultural.
A lot of them, yeah. But others are deeper than that. And when our fears change, so do these things. But it's not quick. Gertrude reckons they've basically been the same since the Industrial Revolution. She and my mum both like to follow Smirk's list of 14.
I mean, there are a lot more than 14 things to be afraid of in the world. Where do you draw the line?
I always think it helps to imagine them like colours. The edges bleed together and you can talk about little differences. Oh, that's indigo, that's more lilac. But they're both purple. I mean, I guess there are technically infinite colours, but you group them together into a few big ones. A lot of it's kind of arbitrary. I mean, why are navy blue and sky blue both called blue when pink's an entirely different colour from red? You know, I don't know, it's just how it works. And like colours, some of these powers, they feed into or balance each other. Some really clash and you just can't put them together. I mean, you could see them all as just one thing, I guess. But it'd be pretty much meaningless, you know, like trying to describe a shirt by talking about the concept of colour. Of course, with these things, it's not a simple spectrum, you know, it's more
an infinite, amorphous blob of terror bleeding out in every direction at once.
Now you're getting it.
Like colours, but if colours hated me. Got it. Christ, I need a cigarette.
Yeah, well, you can wait. I don't know how much longer we have.
Hang on. If these entities are all based on our fear, then what about the rest of...
No. There aren't any godlike powers of hope or love or indigestion or whatever. At least not that I've seen. Just fear. I don't know why.
Fine. So I know a few, but what are they, these 14?
Robert Smirk divided the beings into 14 distinct powers, each comprising a variety of smaller terrors, some direct and practical, and some more abstract.
Right, I know the eye, fear of being watched, right?
Being watched, being followed, having your deepest secrets exposed, needing to know, even if your discoveries might destroy you. The feeling that something, somewhere, is letting you suffer just so it can watch.
Is that me? Is that what I do?
You're the archivist. You tell me.
The spiral is the fear of madness, right? That worry that your world isn't right, that your mind is lying to you.
Yeah, pretty much.
And the end is fear of death.
Simple, but always there.
The stranger is the unknown, the uncanny.
That kind of creeping sense that something's not right. The guy you saw that might be following you might mean you harm.
Isolation.
Smirk called it the lonely. The feeling that you're just alone. Maybe there's no one else there at all, maybe you just can't connect.
Then there's burning, the lightless flame.
The desolation. Fear of pain, fear of loss, fear of unthinking or cruel destruction.
Does it watch over war as well, or is that the end?
I mean, they both get a lot out of war, but you're thinking of the slaughter. It's not cruel exactly or unstoppable like the end. It's just pure violence. Not targeted or premeditated, just unpredictable violence. And you don't know when, or if it's even coming. Sometimes it's aggressive, like a frenzied killer, but Sometimes it's calm, like an army firing shells into a village. The slaughter's not that common in peace, but, well, you know, there's always a war somewhere.
Right. And then there's vertigo, the fear of falling.
The vast. Vertigo, agoraphobia, the dread of deep water, of our own insignificance before the universe.
And on the other side, claustrophobia.
The buried. Small spaces, crushing, you can't breathe. You're at the center of everything and it all pushes down on you. If the vast is like losing yourself in too much space, the buried is being trapped without enough.
Darkness?
The dark, yeah. That's an old one, and one of the deepest. I mean, who isn't a little bit afraid of the dark, or what might be in it?
Yeah. And they're, I think, filth. It's disease, but also insects.
The corruption. Oh, it's a nasty one, that one. Just disgust. Rot, decay, infection. That feeling of your skin crawling or itching, being touched by something that might burrow inside you. Swarming and hollowing you out, leaving you full of holes.
Yeah. Not spiders, though.
No. They belong to the web.
Which is spiders and control, your will not being your own.
Yeah. Being manipulated or puppeted. The worry you're caught in a trap you can't see.
Yes. What about meat? How does that work?
The flesh.
Yeah, I mean, are we really so afraid of being eaten? Of our bodies being all twisted up? Is that, I mean, some people, sure, but how is that one of the 14 great fears?
What? You think people are so special it's only our fear that counts?
What? No.
Everything feels afraid sometimes. No. Sure, maybe it's not as complicated or existential as our fear, but it's real. And there's what, 20 billion chickens in the world? A few billion pigs, cows? How many of them are dying of old age? All that terror, it has to go somewhere. So it does.
And when something formed out of an animalistic fear of the slaughterhouse reaches out to people...
Things get weird, yeah. It gets all mixed up with human neuroses, bodies, gore, you know, that nagging worry that deep down we're all just electrified meat squeezing air at each other.
Good Lord.
I think it's quite new. Only just beginning its ascendance when Smirk labelled it. Before that, there just weren't enough animals for it to be a fear of its own. Back then, I think the only animal fear was the hunt.
The hunt is also animals.
Yeah. Been a long time since humans had any proper sense of our place on the food chain. I mean, we haven't been prey for what, thousands of years?
But I mean, hunting, killing each other, that's just how wild animals work. It's natural.
So's death. But we're still afraid of it.
I suppose. And again, when an animalistic fear touches a human...
You get the predator's granddad out there.
This is... No, I don't have time. Tell me about the rituals.
Well, they all have one. Well, most of them, anyway. It takes centuries to build up to a level of power where they can try it. And if they fail, it's back to square one.
Okay, but what do the rituals do?
They kind of shift the world just enough for the power to come through, merge with reality. Some say, or, well, they guess, that it could bring other entities through with them. I mean, I doubt the buried would be bringing through the vast, but, you know.
But what does that actually mean for the world, merging with reality?
Okay, well, you know how I was just talking about the hunt and the flesh?
Yes.
Well, think of it this way. Right now, all the entities have to act like a hunter. They pick off the weak ones around the edges, the ones that wander too close, and the rest of the time they just have to graze on whatever fear we all passively give away.
And if one of the rituals succeeds?
The world becomes a factory farm.
Why would anyone want that? I mean, there are people, or there used to be people, who are trying to do this. Why?
I don't know. Power, maybe? Or they've just got close enough to their patron or whatever that they also feed on it. I guess maybe some people just have a weird relationship with fear.
And Gertrude wanted to stop them. At any cost.
She worked out they'd all be happening quite close together. She'd already been doing it a while, and the unknowing was the next on her list. That and the Watcher's Crown.
The what?
The Rite of the Watcher's Crown. It's what she called the ritual for the eye. She didn't tell me much about that one, just that she knew how to take care of it. To be honest, when she was going through this stuff, that was about the time I thought I'd found Lightner, so I wasn't much in the mood to listen.
Lightner?
Yeah. Gertrude reckoned he was alive somewhere, said she thought she'd found him. I tracked him down, but it wasn't him.
You're sure?
It was just some pathetic old man. Couldn't have been him. He was so scared of me, I just let him go.
Are you alright?
I think I'm ready to go. I'm done. Hide my page, and when you're out of here, burn it. Please.
I will. Thank you, Jared.
Gerry.
What?
Jared was what my mum called me. I always wanted my friends to call me Gerry.
Thank you, Gerry. I dismiss you. Oh. Alright. I'm ready.
All done?
Yeah. I think so.
I'll get it back in the box.
Did he tell you what you needed?
I don't... Maybe. He told me a lot.
Yeah, he does that.
I mean, I feel like I knew most of it, but...
Hearing it all laid out, right? Like a punch to the gut.
Yeah. You know, after my conversation with Jared, I actually thought I was starting to get a handle on everything. How it works, the connections between it all. It is strangely reassuring to have a statement where once again I find myself having remarkably little idea what it's talking about. That's it then, I think. Except I haven't burned it. Jared's page. Gerry, I know there's more he could tell me. He wouldn't, of course, I know that, but it would still be there, that knowledge. It would still exist. I can't. I want to help. I want to. But I'm scared. Come on, tape, just do it. Do it! You owe me one, Gerry. Rest in, just rest. Nice to get confirmation that whoever Eric was, he was Gerry's father and, well, one assumes Mary Keay's partner. What the hell is the Watcher's Crown? So far the only mention of it I've had is from Gerry, and he didn't seem to know much about what it actually meant. And he's gone now. I suppose wait. Oh, yeah, I think you should probably get down here.
Hello, lad.
You miss us? Sit down.
Well, we check if you're still human enough to believe.
You've got something of ours.
Someone
Took him right from under our noses.
in our own house.
I call that rude, don't you?
Gerry wasn't yours. You had no right to...
You hear that, Julia? Gerry.
Sounds like you've got pretty chummy. Where is he?
Gone.
What do you mean, gone?
Not gonna ask you again, son.
I burned the page. Released him.
On that right noble of you.
Proper humanitarian.
So, let me get this straight. We take you in, protect you from the thing that's hunting you,
Spare your life, even though you're no better.
help you, give you access to one of our most valuable resources, and you steal it from us. Piss off back to England, and then burn it. That's just inconsiderate.
He asked me to.
Oh, really? You always do what evil books tell you to, do you?
And Gerry? Have you seen my son?
No. I've never met him, I'm afraid. Mary talks of him a lot. Well, she seems very proud.
That's not as reassuring as you think it is.
I see your point.
I want you to find my son. If Mary is... if she's gone, or worse, I want you to make sure he's all right.
I'm not exactly a mother figure.
You could hardly do worse than her.
Fine. But I don't know what growing up with Mary has done to him. If he's gone rotten, I can't promise anything.
I understand.
I suppose he might be useful.
Oh, sentimental as ever. I had to get out, to escape this place. I had a son to look after. He needed me. Or so I thought. Or perhaps I actually was afraid. Terrified of the crossroads where I'd found myself, and I chose the option I thought might keep Gerry safe. At least if I was home with him, I could perhaps soften the edges of his mother. I left to avoid dragging my family, my son, into this life, to try and look after him. But Mary decided that a newly blinded husband was simply too much of a burden.
Find anything interesting back there?
Yeah, sorry, I was just,
Curiosity is a very dangerous trait in our line of work, Gerard.
So is ignorance.
Well, you're not going to find many dark secrets in the stationery cupboard.
Just the recorded confession of your evil plans, then.
I'd be something of a fool to leave that one in the recorder.
I've never really seen you use it.
It's generally only for those statements I think might be useful to my successor, or the occasional interview.
So do I get to hear them?
Perhaps, if you live long enough. But somehow I doubt Elias would look favourably on your application. And if I'm being quite honest...
Yeah, I know. And I don't want your job.
Believe me, the perks aren't worth the shackles.
Yeah. So, what's the verdict? On the travels.
Oh, burn it, I think. You said Mr. Hampton was dead.
Yep, and not peacefully.
But you haven't seen its powers.
Not directly.
Well, given the themes of the original, I doubt it has anything that would be worth the danger.
And when in doubt...
Well, quite.
Can I use your waste paper bin?
Yes, it's just... Wait. Surely you didn't bring it here?
Well, yeah,
Gerard, we've talked about this. Bringing unvetted artifacts or books into the archive is incredibly dangerous.
It's locked away.
And I'm sure the lock is very sturdy. But that doesn't stop it being an unnecessary risk.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
This is exactly the sort of thing that will get you killed.
I said I was sorry.
Then we'll say no more about it. I don't enjoy being hard on you, but I really would rather you stayed broadly intact.
I'm touched. You're going soft in your old age.
Well, you are occasionally useful, despite your foolishness.
Flatterer.
You can probably burn it in the back courtyard if you're careful.
Yeah, we'll do.
And for goodness sake, make sure no one sees you. The last thing we need is a letter to Elias about book burnings.
Look, if you have somewhere better to burn these books...
Of course, Gerard. I just happened not to mention the network of sinister tunnels that snake beneath the archive, where I keep all my darkest secrets.
I mean, you joke, but there could be... It's that kind of place.
I rather hope I would have found them by now. I like to think I'm not a complete incompetent.
Until dementia hits.
Given my choice to confide in you, I rather suspect it already has. Go burn your book.
Gertrude.
Hmm?
What happens if we fail?
In what sense?
If we miss a ritual, if one of them works.
Been losing sleep, have you?
Something like that.
If we are lucky, then that failure will also mean our deaths.
You don't think they can reach us after death?
I suppose that depends on your religious beliefs. Personally, I suspect death puts us beyond their power, either because we find ourselves in some kind of afterlife, or because we simply cease to be.
Yeah, I guess.
And I am certain that either scenario is preferable to lingering in a world they control. They are already able to circumvent physics and suspend natural laws. If one were to genuinely press through, I suspect they would rewrite them wholesale, most likely making them utterly incomprehensible to any survivors. They might still need us human enough to be afraid, but beyond that, let's just surmise that petty rules like space or time would be unlikely to factor into the proceedings. They might even stop death entirely, deny us the one last escape, keeping us alive and afraid forever.
And taxes?
Taxes, I imagine, will continue. Beyond that, I honestly don't know. I suppose it depends on which one comes through. The world of the stranger would be very different to that of the corruption.
And if it does happen...
It's my fondest ambition to make sure it does not.
Yeah, sure, but suppose it does.
Very well.
Could it be undone?
No, I don't think so. Once an entity fully manifested, I doubt it would be keen to relinquish its grip on reality. And as for those unlucky enough to survive its rule, I don't think they would be in a state to do anything about it.
Well, then I guess we better not let it happen.
Well, quite. Now, I believe you have an evil book to burn?
Yeah, of course. You, need anything else burning?
No, not right now. I think I'm all right. Thank you for the offer.
Right.
Oh, and Gerard.
Hmm?
Don't go rifling through my things in future. It could end badly for you.